All right, welcome everyone to our first lecture for our Sustainability, Business and Entrepreneurship lecture series. I am so honored and happy to welcome Fred Medlicott again into one of our spaces, many in which he has been a part of in the last few years. Fred Medlicott is a cooperative development specialist for the Northwest Cooperative Development Center, located here in Olympia, but the organization does work all across the country. And Fred is wonderful. We've had him join us several occasions, but he joined the Northwest Cooperative Development Center in 2017 as an intern, and now works for the organization doing co-op development work, and particularly in their ROC program, their cooperative housing program. He got his bachelor's here at the Evergreen State College, so he'll give us a little bit of background about his journey through Evergreen, and where he ends up today, and then go into his topic today. And he is also in the midst of finishing his thesis for the Master's in Management Cooperatives and Credit Union program through St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia. So welcome, Fred. Thanks again so much for joining us. And I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks. Am I coming through good? I'm going to take the silence as a yes. So hi, everybody. I'm Fred. And like Tamsin said, I'm a co-op developer, cooperative development specialist is what my business card says, but we just call ourselves cooperative developers. And basically I help people start co-ops, or I help people with existing co-ops, develop them, make them stronger, more sustainable, do a lot of training and education. The center where I work at is the Northwest Cooperative Development Center. We're actually right downtown on 4th Street. We're above the Pet Works, so across the street from the Voyeur. And the office is actually open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. So if you ever want to drop by and meet us, you're more than welcome. And we're a 501c3, so we're a federally recognized nonprofit, primarily funded. Actually, I'm not sure if this is true anymore, but we have for a long time, we were primarily funded through USDA grants, specifically the one called the Rural Cooperative Development Grant, which is a grant, an annual grant that I think 14 different organizations get across the country, specifically to do cooperative enterprise development in rural areas. And then we also, and when I say we get these grants, I mean we have applied for them and gotten them for the last 10 years, but we're not guaranteed to get them every year. But we also usually apply for and get the Socially Disadvantaged Groups Grant, which is similarly, it's a grant to do business development, but specifically with what the USDA calls socially disadvantaged groups, which is basically any group that is not majority white men, as far as the USDA is concerned. So those are our two main funding sources, although, and we use those to fund our general cooperative development, and I'll explain a little bit more what that means in a second. And then we also have a big cooperative housing program. Specifically, we do a lot of work with mobile and manufactured housing communities, and that's the work right now that I'm the most involved with. So mobile home parks, trailer parks, basically we help the residents when the park is up for sale. We help them, if they're interested, form a cooperative and explore the option of purchasing the park themselves, with the idea of helping them purchase so that in a mobile home park, and this is sort of going to explain the specific benefit of the mobile home park, and then I'll tie that into co-ops in general when I start my presentation proper. But the mobile home parks, right, they typically, the residents own the home, but they don't own the land under the home. They have no control over their rents. And there's very little consumer protections for them, especially in this state. And so what can happen when a park is sold is either the rents can go up dramatically, and then folks can't afford to stay in their home. And also, despite the fact that they're called mobile homes, they're not usually actually movable. So there's a real threat every time the park is sold, and really just from year to year, that they could lose their home, which for a lot of the families represents sort of their biggest equity investment. So it can be really bad if they do. Now, if they form a cooperative and purchase land under their homes, they get control over it. They can set their own rents. They can make sure that repairs and necessary infrastructure improvements are actually happening. And most importantly, they can make sure that that park will never be redeveloped to another purpose. That's a big problem that having right now is that parks are being bought and then redeveloped, and everybody's being made to move. So that's a big part of the work that I've been doing, starting those mobile home cooperatives, and then also providing ongoing training and support, because like a lot of our clients, the folks who live in these mobile home parks, they're not, you know, business people by trade. They didn't set out to start a multi-million-dollar business together. So it requires a lot of training and support to get them going and make them sustainable. Okay, so that's a little bit about the center, a little bit about, oh yeah, and then basically our work is co-op development, like I said, which is more or less just small business development, but specifically for cooperative enterprises. And actually we'll work with any enterprise that is going to be democratically controlled. So we will work with, you know, a business that maybe is incorporated just as a regular C corporation or an LLC. They're not a co-op on paper, but as long as they're practicing democratic control of production or democratic management, then we'll still work with them. So we provide advice, and that's everything from like helping people write business plans, helping them get financing, helping them navigate regulations, helping them do market analysis to figure out if it's even a good idea for them to start the co-op. And so we kind of help people from the idea phase all the way to actually having a co-op that's running. And then we continue to support people kind of as long as they need to make sure that that co-op is healthy and sustainable in the long term. We also do a little bit of lobbying and advocacy. Usually that's pretty targeted, and usually that's when because we're so close to the legislature, we will sometimes kind of be the frontline advocates for, like, there's the Association of Manufactured Homeowners that occasionally puts legislation in to the state to help the manufactured homeowners. And so we get involved with that. We do a little bit of advocacy and lobbying for general cooperative economy in the region, but not as much as I'd like. Everybody always says that, you know, if you're a 501c3 nonprofit, then you can't do lobbying and advocacy, but it's actually not true. It's something like you can spend up to 25% of your budget on lobbying and advocacy as long as you're actually registering as a lobbyist and tracking it. So I'm working on actually growing our lobbying and advocacy program. And then we also do a lot of what we call cooperative networking. So there are, I think, 5 now co-op networks, regional co-op networks, just in this state alone. One in the South Sound, one out on the peninsula, one up north in Skagit, one on the east side of the mountain, actually 2 on the east side of the mountains now, one down in Palouse, and the other one's up north, I think Spokane area. And so we're helping those networks get going, and those are cross-industry, cross-sector networks. So it's all different types of co-ops and all different types of industry coming together to do lobbying and advocacy for themselves, co-marketing, skill sharing, training, and education. So we're helping get those networks started, and then we're also helping create a top-level network of networks across the state. So our remit is basically to help people start co-ops, help existing co-ops, and grow and expand the regional cooperative economy. Yeah, so that's the center. That's the work I do. Hopefully that all made sense. Now I'm going to actually share my screen and explain what is a co-op. Maybe. Let's see. Is that working? Is everybody seeing what they're supposed to be seeing, hopefully?
Yeah. We see, yes, we see the browser with the document and presentation.
Okay, yeah, and let me there we go. Now you're not seeing the browser, hopefully.
That's correct.
Great. Okay. Thanks, folks. I'm a professional. It's fine. So there is me, and I am standing in front of what's called the Toad Lane store. And here's a drawing of it. This is in a small city called Rockdale in Northern England. And the reason that this store is significant is when we're talking about the cooperative movement internationally, this is really considered to be where the cooperative enterprise model first really concretized. So there were a lot of different experiments. This is in the 1800s. oh gosh, I should know this, but I want to say 1873, but it might be 1856. Those are both significant dates. I'm not sure which. But there had been experiments in cooperation, specifically cooperative enterprise, you know, before the Rockdale store and the Toad Lane store and the Rockdale cooperators. But the Rockdale model is considered to be the first sort of all the lessons from those early experiments taken, combined, and then to create a cooperative that functioned and actually continued to last. And so what started as a little cooperative store whose purpose was just to make sure that people could get things like tallow, candles, and flour at reasonable prices and reasonable quality. Eventually grew into what was called the Cooperative Wholesale Society in the UK, which was one of the largest manufacturers, and they made everything from bicycles to tea to glasses. They were producing films. It was a pretty massive conglomerate of cooperative.
Oh, Fred, we lost audio.
Stores, and then a couple other like an insurance arm, and it's still a pretty robust organization, but it's not quite as expansive as it was. This first store though was created basically because you couldn't get flour that didn't have sawdust in it. And you couldn't buy tallow and be sure that the person wasn't using a weighted scale, that you were getting a fair price and you're actually getting what you paid for. So the idea behind this original store was that the consumers would own it. So the people that needed to buy those products would own the store. They actually staffed it with volunteer labor originally. And they sold things at cost. So they sold the cost of the product was what it cost the co-op to get it, and plus whatever the additional was to keep the rent on Toad Lane paid. And what it meant was it was actually the first time in Northern England that people could go and buy things like flour and know that it was going to be safe and actually what they were buying. And in fact, they had to do a big education campaign in the area, because what happened was that people were going and they were buying flour, and they were basically, they were saying that this flour is all white, something must be wrong with it. It was because they were so used to getting flour that had been adulterated that they hadn't seen just proper white flour before. So they actually had to educate people on what flour was supposed to look like. And so, yeah, so that store is where the cooperative model sort of first took root in a meaningful way, and in a sustainable way. There had been some sort of utopian socialist attempts at different cooperative models before this with varying degrees of success. Most of those didn't work because they were largely supported by just sort of socially minded benefactors. There was one guy in particular, Proudhon, but once they lost interest, the projects weren't sustainable. I think the kind of miracle of this first Rockdale co-op was that it was sustainable, that they were providing quality products at a very reasonable price, an affordable price to people, and keeping the lights on and making sure the operation sustained itself, and even started generating a surplus. And so what they did with the surplus was they kept close accounts of everything you bought at the store, and at the end of the year, when they figured out the surplus, which is what a capitalist would call the profit, they divvied it up. They called it a dividend, or the divvy, and they would divvy it up between all of the members in proportion to what you had spent. So if you had spent, say, 5% of the total pass-through of the store in a given year, you would be entitled to 5% of the surplus at the end of the year, with a little bit held back for reinvestment and expansion. And the reason that I like this drawing with the two buildings is that next door is a pub. And so famously, the folks would all line up outside the store on divvy day, get their divvy, and then go right next door and have a big party at the pub. So it's fun to think about for me, I guess. They now also, the UK Cooperative Society has added this big modern museum wing you can kind of see on the left-hand side there. So it's got all different products and history from the Cooperative Wholesale Society's lifetime. It's really, really cool to see. So what do we mean when we say a cooperative? When I'm talking about cooperatives, I'm talking somewhat narrowly and specifically about the cooperative enterprise model as originally established at this Toad Lane store in Rockdale, and then carried forward through today to the International Cooperative Alliance, which is the top level organization for cooperative enterprises across the globe. So in North America, we've got the NCBA, the National Cooperative Business Association. That's the top level national organization for cooperatives. And then that is networked with other national and even continental networks into the International Cooperative Alliance, who's basically the steward of the cooperative model. And they also set out what are known as the cooperative principles and values, which are have been were first set out by the Rockdale cooperators, but have been expanded on and deepened since over the intervening almost 200 years now. And the International Cooperative Alliance meets semi-regularly to discuss those principles and values and update them and make sure that they're still in line with what the actual contemporary practice internationally is in the cooperative enterprise movement. So the dictionary says a cooperative is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. There are some basic features of a cooperative enterprise that set it apart from a capitalist firm, just structurally. So in a capitalist firm or an individual-owned firm, the control over the business is granted by virtue of access to capital. So whoever has the most capital to purchase the most shares has the largest voice in the organization. In a cooperative, it's the members of the co-op, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what membership means, but it's the members of the cooperative who have control of the organization, and they have that control on the basis of one member, one vote. So irrespective of how much capital a given member has, they still only have one vote in the affairs of the cooperative. So that's one of the big differentiating factors. Sometimes people in the movement will say that capitalist firms put capital at the center of the organization, that's the sort of highest purpose is to serve capital. For the cooperative, its highest purpose is to actually serve its members, the people. So rather than a business is strictly focused on generating as much profit as possible, you've got a business that's focused on generating as much benefit as possible for the actual members. And in order to do that, to generate benefit for the membership, the cooperative has to operate in a way that is aligned with the cooperative principles and values. So these are the values. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but this is what the International Cooperative Alliance believes are the baseline values for cooperation globally. So self-help, self-responsibility, and self-help, what they mean is not just on an individual level, but communities building resources and fixing market problems for themselves rather than relying on outside intervention, either through the state or charitable or like the, it's not the CIA, the USAID, USAID, stuff like that. Self-responsibility, that means that you, part of being a member of the cooperative, you get the benefits of the co-op, but you're also responsible for it. Democracy, and that can mean a lot of things. That's actually part of what I'm writing my thesis about. What do we mean when we say democracy? But broadly speaking, it means a level power structure where people are interacting as equals within the organization. Oops. Equality both within and without the, the organization. I clicked too much. Equality and equity within and without the organization, and then solidarity again in the organization and more broadly with the social movements towards economic, social, environmental justice. The cooperative principles are, to my mind, a little more nitty-gritty and really lay out what sets apart a capitalist business from a cooperative business. So capitalist business, highest purpose is to maximize return for shareholders. Cooperative business, highest purpose is to provide benefit to the members while also adhering to these other principles. So voluntary and open membership means you can't force anybody to be a member. And you've got to allow anyone that's qualified to become a member to become a member. Democratic member control, we've already talked about that a little bit, but that has to be on the basis of one member, one vote. I just remembered I have notes. Member economic participation. This means both actual dollars invested into the business and allocating surplus to reinvest into the business. So when you start the business, the members are typically paying, at the very least, they're buying a membership share that represents some level of equity investment into the enterprise. And then at the end of every year, every fiscal period, depending on the co-op, like I said, they determine what's their surplus. So what was their income, what were their expenses, what's left over at the end after taxes and debt is serviced and all that. And then a portion of that is usually paid out in the form of a dividend, or what we call patronage, to the members, and a portion of that is reinvested in the business. That can happen in a couple different ways, but it's really best understood as the cooperative members taking a part of their share of the surplus and reinvesting it in the business. And sometimes that's almost in the form of a loan through internal capital accounts, which is a little in the weeds. But often that is just the co-op will have sort of a baseline, like we'll always reinvest 30% of our surplus into the business. And that's money that, you know, could be going to the members, and actually often in a capitalist corporation would be going to shareholders or C-suite executives. But the co-ops tend to have higher levels of reinvestment. So that's what we mean by member economic participation. Sometimes that's shortened by people to just, you have to have skin in the game. Autonomy and independence. So there are organizations that are controlled by their members. And again, that's really talking about autonomy and independence from other actors in the market, and also state and intrastate organizations. So part of the cooperative movement historically has been, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about Spain and Mondragon, part of the idea of the cooperative movement has been to build sort of community power and alternative institutions in order to ensure that the community has control over its own resources and can meet its own needs. Education, training, and information. This is really important, especially because cooperatives have to be, you know, the membership is making management and governance decisions for the cooperative. So ongoing education, training, and information, both internally in the co-op and again, externally in the community, is really, really important. Cooperation among cooperatives, that means that co-ops need to have a commitment to working with other co-ops as often as they can. And there's a growing understanding that actually this means that cooperatives need to be investing in starting more cooperatives. And then finally, concern for community. So cooperatives work for the sustainable development of their communities through policies approved by their members, is what the ICA says. Concern for community, I expect at the next big meeting will get expanded into a little more specifically, and I expect that we'll go from 7 principles to 8 or 9, and they'll be talking about environmental justice, social justice, racial justice, gender justice explicitly. Historically, those have just kind of gotten rolled into concern for community, but I think there's a growing awareness that needs to be elucidated more clearly, and those things need to be separated out. So these are the principles of the cooperative enterprise model. And these principles are rooted in those values that I talked about. And all of the empirical research on this topic shows that cooperatives are most successful, both from the perspective of how they're impacting the planet, the environment, their community, their country that they're operating in, the market that they're operating in, but also literally just in a dollars and cents of how much money are they making and how much are they spending way. Co-ops are more successful when they what we call operationalize those values and principles, and co-ops that tack away from this, which is
I think we lost audio again.
Fred, are you there? Isn't technology wonderful, folks?
Because those are sort of ancillary to the core
Hey,
business.
Fred.
Yes.
Sorry, we lost you for like the last 30 seconds or so. So can you go back? Yeah.
Maybe. What was I saying?
The last thing we kind of heard was you were talking about sort of concern for community,
Okay.
that it was going to expand and think more about environmental justice, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's kind of been an ongoing debate, I think, for like 30 years. And at this last meeting, which was in 2014, there was a loud contingent that wanted to add the principles, and it didn't make it through, but it's gotten more support every time. So like I say, I'm really expecting that to happen. And what I started to say was that all of the empirical research shows that cooperative enterprises that operationalize these principles and values perform better, both in terms of impacts on the environment, impacts on the community, impacts on the members, the workers, or the consumers, but also just strictly even on capitalist terms of efficiencies in terms of inputs and outputs, bottom line, return on investment. Cooperatives perform better when they embody those values and when they operationalize these principles. And what often happens, because we have a management class just globally that has not really been acculturated to the cooperative enterprise model, that is used to operating in a capitalist framework, often what happens when a cooperative hits a crisis or a difficult point is people assume that they need to call it market isomorphism. They assume that in order to succeed in the market, then we've got to look more and more like our capitalist competitors. And that actually sort of hollows out the heart of the cooperative, and over time ends up decreasing the performance. And sort of paradoxically, as they're making these what they think are sort of firm-minded business decisions, they're actually sort of eroding what the cooperative actually is, which is not just a business. Cooperative. Oh, here are some of the manufactured housing parks that I work with. These are actual communities that I work with. Hidden Village on the top left there. They're only about 8 minutes outside of Olympia. And then Woodbrook is up in Lakewood, and that's some of the folks having an election at the Evergreen Estates. So a cooperative is not just a business, it's an association and it's an enterprise. And so those two things are held in tension. The association, who makes it up? It's the membership. So the membership forms an association of people that have gathered together to meet their shared needs, be they social, economic, cultural, and ideally any given cooperative is meeting all three of those needs. So the co-op is an association made up of people who have a shared need. Often people say that cooperatives are intended to address market failure. So, and market failure gets defined a lot of different ways. It's actually a pretty squishy concept in my opinion. But basically what they mean is, in a situation where the capitalist marketplace is not providing a needed good or service, or is providing it in a way that is not acceptable to consumers or workers or producers, or if a producer of something, say a farmer, doesn't have access to markets that they need. These are all considered the market failures that co-ops can address. And so like in the example of that original Rockdale co-op, they were addressing the market failure of they just couldn't get safe food and basic goods in a sort of safe, affordable, and reliable way. So those are the economic needs. More and more people are recognizing that these co-ops also are formed to meet social and cultural needs. I don't think I'm going to have time to unpack that, but there's a growing understanding that looking at enterprises and employment just from the perspective of sort of classical economics or even neoliberal economics and contract law doesn't capture the whole picture, because the workplace where you work and the organizations you're involved in are significant sites of identity formation. And so it's interesting. People are kind of going back to Durkheim and looking at the concept of anomie and early sociological concepts, and more starting to recognize that the cooperative model is not just addressing people's economic needs, but it's also actually serving to recreate some of the community institutions and social ties that existed before we had such an aggressively neoliberalized market where things are so atomized. So there's this association. It's also an enterprise or a business. So you've got to know, what is your value proposition? What are you actually bringing to market? And there are, broadly speaking, 3 different types of cooperatives. You can have a consumer cooperative. That's what most people, I think, are familiar with. Olympia Food Co-op is a consumer cooperative. REI is a consumer cooperative. And those are businesses that are owned by the customers. You can also have producer cooperatives. So Ocean Spray, Land of Lakes, Organic Value. Those are 3 examples of agricultural producer co-ops. And that's where you've got independent producers, in those cases farmers, who have formed a cooperative in order to co-market their products, and also to do things like share facilities. So maybe a given farm, it doesn't make sense for them to build an entire packing house, but all the farms in a region, it does. And so you've got worker cooperatives, producer co-ops. That's co-ops that are owned and operated by the people who are making the products that are being sold through the cooperative. And then you can also have worker co-ops, which are businesses that are owned by the people who work there. So those are the 3 different types of co-ops. All of them need to have a value proposition. What is the good or service they're bringing to market? What are the business's needs in terms of capital, labor, et cetera? And then how is that business democratically controlled? So how is it governed? How is it managed? Those are all aspects of the enterprise. And these things are all held in tension. So there's the association and the enterprise that's internal to the cooperative, and they're often in tension, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then there's the marketplace, or the environment that the cooperative is in. And so that's like the market that you're in, the industry that you're in, laws and regulations, partners, vendors, stakeholders. So there's the association and the enterprise internally, and then externally, there's the market or the environment that the business is operating in, and they've got competing needs. So the association also is made up of individual members, and members in the association have competing needs. So if the members are feeling like no one in the co-op listens, they might have a governance issue. The individual members may want something as cheap as possible, but that might not be long-term sustainable for the business. Often in worker cooperatives, you've got people who want to retire, but the business it's not clear how the business is going to get the equity out for them to do that. So these are ways that an individual member might have a conflict with the association. I want my retirement now. The association's not able to afford it. Between the association and the enterprise. So the association may want to see improvement projects, such as even things like benefits, like we want health insurance. Well, the members of the association want health insurance, the enterprise may not be able to afford it, and then you've got to navigate how do you make that work. Volunteer time. Is the cooperative relying on volunteers? Is the volunteer situation working? OFC, the Olympia Food Cooperative, uses a lot of volunteers, which is great, but that also puts some strain on the association side of things. And sometimes those with the volunteers who are members of the association it can be in conflict with what the enterprise actually needs. Things like rent increases. If you're living in a housing cooperative, I don't want my rent to go up, but at the enterprise level, we need to raise the rent by $15 a month for this next year in order to meet all of our, meet our budget and complete all the projects we need. So, and then you can also have competing needs between the enterprise and the market. You may need capital, but you're having a hard time accessing it. There could be regulations that are not favorable to the enterprise. And then really just neoliberalization in general creates a market that is very hostile to cooperation. Yeah, I won't elaborate on that at the moment. So the way that a cooperative functions successfully is when it holds these things in equilibrium, so it navigates those tensions. There's this idea called the paradox perspective, which is that you've got these different lenses to look at the co-op through, and they're all valid, but they're not mutually intelligible necessarily. And so part of successful, healthy, sustainable cooperatives long term is learning to navigate these tensions. And it's often classical economists, neoliberal economists will criticize the cooperative model because of these tensions. They'll say they've got these inherent structural tensions that make the organization inefficient or that will ultimately doom the enterprise. And that's all sort of based on economic theory. In practice, what we actually see in the world in real life for the last 150 years is that those tensions actually result in a significant amount of innovation and in an active process of refining this enterprise and association model so that it can meet the needs of these different priorities. So again, just like the values and principles, things that are often considered a weakness of the cooperative model are actually really its strengths. So in short, cooperatives work best when they balance the needs of individual members, the association, the enterprise, and the marketplace while staying true to the values and principles of cooperation. And here's just some cool historical pictures of co-ops from around the world. And that's something that I really want people, I would like for everybody to come away understanding, because I think often, to the extent that people understand cooperatives at all, people often think like, well, it's a good idea, but it doesn't work in all situations, or like, well, it's great, but when push comes to shove, it doesn't really work. It only works for social projects, or you have to have volunteers. And none of that stuff is true. So all of the empirical research demonstrates that cooperatives compared to capitalist firms in every industry, in every sector, at every scale, and in every economy where this has been looked at, cooperatives outperform capitalist enterprises, and by almost every metric except executive pay. So wages for the lowest paid workers are higher, wage equity is better between the lowest and highest paid workers, reinvestment into the business is higher, they use their capital more efficiently, they invest a significantly higher percentage of their profits back into their local community. And one of the key features of a cooperative is, and this is why sort of they run so directly counter to the neoliberal idea, is that the cooperative is sort of radically embedded in place, that the actual people who actually live in the place where the cooperative is operating are the members, and the organization exists to benefit them. What that means is that, for example, all the people who work and shop at Olympia Food Cooperative don't have any incentive to offshore that business. Or if you're a worker at a tech cooperative firm, there's no reason you would never vote to take away your own job and send it somewhere else. And the cooperative businesses are more sustainable. So it's something like 10% of capitalist firms survive the first 5 years, and 80% of I might be getting this wrong. It's 10% of capitalist firms either survive the first year or the first 5 years. But I know that cooperatives have an 80% survival rate at the 5-year mark. So they last longer, they're started and they operate more efficiently. They've got more positive impacts overall. And because of the embeddedness of the cooperative principles and values, you see across the world, you see things where you can draw a direct through line through the actions and practices of, say, agricultural cooperatives, especially in developing nations, quote unquote developing nations. You see that the agricultural cooperatives are often at the front line of driving things like environmental sustainability, food system change, racial equity, gender equity, and cooperatives are often adopted as a resistance strategy by people specifically to resist the sort of acid bath of neoliberalism. But I don't think I'm going to do that slide because I'm realizing I've taken way too much time already, and we do want to do questions, right?
Yes. Yeah. Is this a place to stop for questions?
I think so. Hopefully that was
Okay.
somewhat cogent.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Let's take a moment of just to say thanks or clap, snaps or something in the chat, some emojis. So I'm gonna open the floor for questions. Right now, I'm gonna invite folks who want to speak their questions into existence, and then I will also uplift a few questions that have come through in the chat.
Yeah, so let's see. So it's agricultural producer co-ops are the largest sector in the US. I think I'm getting this right. I'm at least getting the top three right. So I think agricultural producer cooperatives are the largest in the US. And then I believe they're actually followed by consumer co-ops generally, but specifically not retail consumer cooperatives, but rural electric associations. So something like 70% of the United States geographically gets its power through consumer-owned utilities. It's not 70% by population because it's in all the rural areas, but the majority geographically of the United States is actually powered by consumer-owned utilities. And then worker co-ops is like a tiny fraction of the overall cooperative economy in the US. And that's unfortunate. It's the number. If I could only pick one, that's the one I would pick, I would say. So definitely trying to drive worker cooperative development is something that we're really focused on, both at the center and then sort of nationally and internationally in the cooperative development sector. Features of neoliberalism are the idea, right, that the market is the ideal mechanism basically for everything, right? So this idea that, and that's why I really don't like the concept of market failure. For example, they'll call it a market failure if a power company is not willing to put a utility in a rural area because their return on their investment wouldn't be worth it for them to do that. And so then the cooperative exists to quote unquote address that market failure. But that's not really a failure of the market. That's exactly what the capitalist market is supposed to be doing. If there's not profit to be made, they shouldn't be investing there. So it's actually the market functioning exactly as it's intended to. And then specifically neoliberalism, right? So we're talking about globalized capital, so borderless enterprise, the free movement of capital, but the restricted movement of people. Deregulation is usually a big part of it, financialization. And then there's also, people would argue that things like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and their sort of loans that come with specific packages of reforms that have to be implemented is probably one of the biggest ways that the change from, I don't think I'm going to talk about Hayek and Keynes, but liberalism, broadly speaking, was just the idea that like individual autonomous rational actors can participate in markets, and then that on its own can sort of serve to make sure that society is meeting everybody's needs. Neoliberalism is that same idea, but kind of on steroids. And so examples of big neoliberal reforms that you might be aware of are like NAFTA. NAFTA was a big neoliberal reform, and it was when, I think a lot of people became aware of offshoring, and that's because that capital is now not bounded within a state. It can move freely across the globe, and so they'll do things like close a factory here so they can put it there because they can pay those folks even less. That's an example of neoliberalism. And then on a more individual level, things like gig work, unstable employment, contract employment versus full hire employment. Those are all also features of the neoliberalized labor market. And then to go back to what I was sort of obliquely talking about, the sociological aspect of enterprises, a lot of people will say that neoliberalism, there's a phrase, it's an acid bath for social relations. And what it does is it takes us, it instead of being a citizen or a community member, or another way of thinking of yourself, you're just an individual market actor. And so it atomizes people. And it's also, like I was saying, because work and the other organizations that we're members of and that we take a part of are such significant sites of identity construction in a world where you have, job, unstable employment, temporary employment, gig employment, you get a lot of what's called anomie, which is when the sort of structures and rituals of society that used to give people identity and structure their lives and give their lives meaning don't exist. And so that's why some people would argue you see just sort of like this widespread malaise and discontentment. I don't know if that was helpful, but.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Capitalists already have all the money, is my opinion. Economists will argue there are things like the quote unquote horizon problem, which the horizon problem basically says that in a worker controlled or member controlled enterprise, they won't do long-term planning such that when it's time for members to exit the enterprise, they won't be able to take their equity out. And so then the business has to be sold or otherwise not return the proper equity that it was invested by the members to them. And like, just to take that specific example, that was a solved problem in, I think, 1923 in Italy with what's called internal capital accounts, where they keep track of how much money how much equity each member has invested in the business. And they have a concrete plan for paying that out or paying a percentage of that out or a percentage return on that investment. And effectively, it just turns reinvestment into the business into a loan that the worker or the member owner is making to the business in order to support its operations. And most of the explanations that you will see in the literature for why cooperatives are not the dominant enterprise model rely on it. I'm being a little glib, but they basically boil down to someone in 1964 hypothesized this, ergo this must be true, with almost no actual engagement or analysis with like really existing cooperative economies. So yeah, in my opinion, the biggest barriers are access to capital. So the communities that have had all of their money stolen by capitalists don't have the money, like the money's already been expropriated, so we don't have it to start these co-ops. There's almost complete regulatory capture by capitalists globally. And so we have market conditions and regulations that are favorable to capitalist enterprise and not favorable to cooperative enterprise, although that's changing somewhat. I think as people start to understand that the crisis of capitalism is very real. And then you also just have ideologically, like in the United States, right? We're so heavily propagandized to think of ourselves as these like atomized, individualized entrepreneurs, that you have a lot of cultural conditioning that makes people resist the model, even though it's just like sort of when you put the basic ideas of, say, a like European democratic socialist state, for example, in front of people, but you like don't use certain words, almost everyone broadly agrees that that's good. But then if you say that it's socialist, they say it's bad. There's a lot of that with cooperatives too. So it's a complex situation, but in my opinion, most of the problems are not actually inherent to the model. They're cultural, and they're just structurally, literally, the capitalists already have all the money.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. So a million different ways, but basically more than one person identifies a common or shared cultural, economic, or social need, or a package of needs that fall into all three of those areas. They get together, they say, how do we address this? They somehow are already aware of or learn about the cooperative enterprise model. And then it really is just like starting any other business. You got to make sure that the idea makes sense. You've got to find capital to finance the idea. And then you've got to put, policy and operational procedures in place to get the business going. And then there's the added complexity of governance design. Oh, I should have, gosh. So one of the baseline factors or features of Rockdale cooperative model, which is the most common cooperative model, more or less, is it's a representative democracy. So you've got one member, one vote on the members, and often the members will make certain key decisions, but then they'll also elect a board of directors or a council or committee, whatever they want to call it, that is supposed to be making decisions for the members' benefit that are representative of their desires. And so you've got to, when you're starting a cooperative, one of the things you're also doing is designing your own governance. So are we going to have a board of directors that's elected? Are we going to have multiple councils? And because often with clients, they'll ask well, how does this work in a cooperative? And usually the answer is well, kind of however you guys all decide you want to do it. So there's a lot of deciding how you want to do it. And then there's the other normal starting a business stuff of making sure it's a good idea, finding the capital, etc. With us, it's people call or email and they say, hey, I sell sunflower seeds and I want to expand the business and make it into a co-op. Or increasingly, we've got people who are calling and saying I have an existing business like Orca Books, Voyeur, very briefly, Burial Grounds, New Moon. I'm missing some, but just to give some examples in downtown Ole, right? Those were existing businesses that the owner wanted to sell, and then they were converted to cooperative ownership by being purchased by the workers. So that's another way that cooperatives can be formed. Either they're a new enterprise from whole cloth, or it's an existing business that's being converted. There is also international development and domestic development where you might have a cooperative that is not actually formed by the people who are going to be its members and need the benefit, but it's formed by an outside institution or organization like a nonprofit or something. That's what we call top-down cooperative development. And it's in my opinion and empirically, hugely inefficient and a bad way to do it. So it really has to be a bottom-up process where the people who actually have the shared needs that this organization is going to meet are involved in the design and planning of the co-op. Yeah, I don't know, does that answer the question? And then in terms of how long does it take? We got the Northwest Painters Cooperative started in 4 months. And then we've had other cooperative projects where it was 6 years from the first meeting to when they actually got going. So. You borrow it, right? Just like a loan, like a normal business would get. And that's increasingly common for a long time. And still it's difficult. It's more difficult for cooperatives to access capital than it is for capitalist firms to access capital because they're just not promising the same return on investment for one thing. Although increasingly, I actually think that's not the real reason. It's mostly just because lending agencies don't understand what a cooperative is, and because they can't have a single person on the hook for the loan. got, if Olympia Food Cooperative borrows money, then there's 14,000 members that are collectively responsible for that loan, which from the bank's perspective is somehow less secure than if it was just one person, which doesn't make any sense to me. But people borrow, so traditional finance, but also there's a lot of CDFIs, which are community development finance institutions, which are federally chartered nonprofit banks that have a specific mission to lend in a market that is not being served by traditional capital. So there are banks that exist just to make loans to co-ops, and then donations, fundraising, and then also member equity. So it depends on the cooperative, but for example, we helped a group of marine surveyors, environmental and marine surveyors, create a cooperative firm, and they all paid in something like 15 grand of their own money, each member. I think they made a lot of money, so they could swing it. But so you're raising money from the initial members, you're raising money from the community often, and you're borrowing money or finding grants. Sometimes somebody just like has family wealth, and that's another, that's kind of the classic way to start a business. It depends. So if you're talking about REI, actually, I normally I use REI as kind of a good example of a co-op that is only nominally a co-op, except that I think that maybe they are actually actively involved in supporting cooperative development in the global South. So that's a bad example. But like Organic Valley is not actively engaged in building solidarity with other sort of solidarity economic projects, for example. And traditionally traditionally cooperatives, OFC is actually more of an outlier than not here, because OFC has a longstanding relationship with Nicaragua and their cooperative economy as well. So they'll send the folks from OLI will go there, like every 3 years or something, and then the next 2 years, delegation from there will come here. And actually, it was cool. The last delegation that visited, half of them were Sandinistas, like the like rifle holding kind. And it was really funny because they came to our cooperative development office and they were like totally blown away that the government was actually supporting the development of cooperatives and not trying to quash it. And we had to explain like, well, this is kind of a different context. The real answer, I think, is that kind of thing primarily is happening within the worker cooperative movement. And I would argue that the worker cooperative movement domestically is probably the most, I don't like the word progressive, but like meaningfully leftist sort of labor movement in the country. And really strong ties with organizations like Ciclo Se Sola and Sacopa, which are Sacopa's International Worker Cooperative Alliance. Ciclo Se Sola is, okay, so Ciclo Se Sola is in Venezuela. So Solidarity Association, that's the top level Solidarity Association of Co-ops in Venezuela. So yeah, a lot of interaction between the US worker cooperative movement and sort of radical solidarity economics projects. I think internationally in general, but also specifically in the quote unquote global South. In Washington, mostly the support looks like either trying to do responsible sourcing or things like sending delegations. There's not a lot of like direct ties I'm aware of, although there's a growing understanding that that's important. So I'm hoping that we see more of that. I mean, I guess it depends how much money you start with. No, I mean, if you had capital on hand right now to purchase like shares of shareholder corporations that are going to give you a good return on investment, that's almost unquestionably a faster way to accumulate capital, would be through participating in the capitalist market. So yes, you can accumulate more capital as a capitalist than as a cooperator. As in terms of economic and social mobility, if we're taking those basically as proxies for capital accumulation, then I think probably the answer is that yeah, you accumulate more capital operating as a capitalist in the capitalist market than as a cooperator in the cooperative market. I think that the reality is that the vast majority of people don't have the option to participate in the financial markets at all. And so in the case for the vast majority of people, they would be their economic and social mobility is absolutely improved by being a member of a cooperative, either as a consumer, producer, or worker, than being a worker, consumer, or producer just strictly in the capitalist marketplace. Does that make sense? So, yeah, I mean, like if you're asking, like the sometimes people ask that, right? Like, well, won't I, could I make more money operating as a capitalist in the capitalist market? And the answer is like, yep, almost certainly. But then you're doing the opposite of sort of contributing to a international movement towards solidarity economy. So in general, I'm a co-op dork, and I just get excited about co-ops in general. Specifically, the thing that is my kind of personal bugbear is as a cooperative developer, what I'm really pushing for regionally and nationally is the creation of cooperative networks that either house or support cooperative development funds, and those cooperative development funds are community or cooperative capital, community controlled capital that would be used to finance the development of new cooperatives. And then those new cooperatives, as a condition of that financing, would agree that once they reach a certain surplus target, or however it would be constructed, it's different places. But once they're sustainable, they've hit a point where they're confident they're sustainable, then something like 3% of their surplus annually gets reinvested into that fund. And so long term, and this is exactly what they've done in Mondragon in Spain and in Basque Spain, and then also what they've done in northern Italy. I get the name of the region confused with the name of the cheese, but around Bologna, Emilia Reggiana, I think maybe is the name of the region. That's either the name of the region or the descriptor for the cheese, but where they make Parmesan. And so for me, that's what I really want to see, because the biggest barrier currently to the expansion of the cooperative economy in this country is simply getting capital in the hands of communities. And so creating that kind of sort of closed loop, positive feedback cycle of funding cooperative development and then successfully funding cooperative development means more funding for even more successful cooperative development. That's what I'm really excited about.
Awesome, thank you. There is one question. I think this might be the last question because I'm not seeing any other hands. Let me just grab it. Okay, what is the relationship between co-op development in the G7 countries and global imperialism, particularly unequal exchange? To what degree is the cooperative movement in the G7 countries supported by the fruits of imperialism?
Equal exchange, the coffee company in specific, or like fair trade, direct trade in general? I think that cooperatives consistently fail to live up to the cooperative principles and values and especially domestically in the United States, when you expand the lens beyond the specific community in which they're embedded and go further. I would say even just sort of nationally, but especially internationally. So things like supply chains, sourcing, product selection, treatment of employees and workers in contracted firms. There's like robust evidence that cooperatives are better than capitalist firms with respect to those things, but it's an order of they're not an order of magnitude better. So they're better, but they're not great. And a lot of cooperatives still do have what I would argue is an exploitative relationship between their suppliers, their international suppliers, and even more so, or not even more so, but even sometimes their actual members. So for example, this specific example, I might be speaking a little bit out of turn because I don't know everything about the organization, but there's a newer both worker and producer cooperative. I should have mentioned that. That's called multi-stakeholder. So those three types of cooperative: worker, producer, consumer. That increasingly we're seeing what are called solidarity cooperatives or multi-stakeholder cooperatives, where you've got one, more than one of those stakeholder groups at the same time. Oh, Pachamama. From what I have been able to discern from looking at the financials that I can see, it's a worker cooperative in the United States, and they have producer members in several different countries, in South America and Africa, where they've got coffee producers who are members, and then they ostensibly are receiving their fair share of the value that is created by shipping those coffees to or whatever you want to call them, imperial core states. I don't think that that's actually happening. I think that they're getting like significantly more of the value that they've produced than they would be selling just on the commodities market to a capitalist firm. But I don't believe that like they've meaningfully achieved equality between sort of North American managerial class and the actual producers of the product. What you are seeing increasingly is those producer cooperatives, those international producer cooperatives, which is like a major part of the cooperative economy globally, and is a very effective way to build community control and community resources by putting together these producer cooperatives, especially for producers that have traditionally operated in commodity markets where they're not, they're capturing almost none of the value of their product. The first successful cooperatives in North America that weren't just banks were actually fishing cooperatives in Nova Scotia, because the fishermen figured out that they were getting paid like 50 cents a barrel of fish. And then the fishmongers who then sent the barrels south were getting like $10 a barrel for the fish. And they finally figured out like, well, what if we just sent the barrels down there? So, and you can see like the Zapatistas, there's Zapatista coffee that you can buy that is produced by, and like produced, roasted, and distributed by Zapatista coffee cooperatives. And like they are capturing pretty much the full value of the products that they're producing. And then also there's some pretty tricky areas. I get in trouble a lot at conferences and stuff because, USAID internationally is one of the biggest drivers of cooperative development. And that's ostensibly good, except for the fact that often those projects are not really designed to build community resources and control. They're designed to provide access to goods for the imperial core states, and or a way to sort of condition the market in a given country, or have leverage. And then specifically, there are like U.S. foreign intelligence operations that are conducted under the guise of sort of international development, but specifically cooperative development as well. So it's complicated. There's a growing awareness that the best way, and this goes back to that top-down versus bottom-down development, there's a growing awareness that the most successful way to foster cooperative development in quote-unquote developing nations or the global south, that like you just give people the capital that they need in order to self-develop the cooperatives that they need to meet their shared cultural, economic, and social needs. And then people develop healthy cooperatives that they're invested in that are robust and sustainable. So more and more the cooperative development sector is recognizing that like they don't need, we need to take capital from the imperial core states and then send it to places outside of the imperial core states so that they can use it for whatever they think they need to the communities can use it to self-determine what they need. I'm not sure if I'm being clear, but that's my answer to that question.
That was a fantastic answer. Thank you very much. That was very informative. What was that international co-op organization?
CICOPA, CICOPA.
Okay, thanks.
A couple questions in there. The first one I'll answer is you asked like, how do I handle the sort of complexities of the situation? And I would argue pretty clumsily. So yeah, to be perfectly clear, the USAID and also I think just many NGO organizations that exist in what did somebody say, the G7 states do like meaningfully good work all over the globe. I want to be clear about that. It's complicated by the fact that they're specifically in the context of support for solidarity economy movement more broadly. It is complicated, but I'm not saying that like everyone who has worked there or every project that they've done is unequivocally bad. I would argue that the majority of it probably has been positive. Just to be clear on that. Second, as to what research methods, the normal ones. Statistical analysis, there's one academic that's done a bunch of work more recently, just specifically comparing. So usually it's an apples to apples comparison is the way that they want to do it. Specifically recently, there's been some a specific researcher who has been really focused on Uruguay. My Spanish is very bad.
Uruguay.
Uruguay.
Yes, Uruguay.
Thank you. And because they register all of the corporations and cooperative corporations through the same central database and collect a lot of metrics. So there's some important metrics that are not being collected. So they've been looking at things like sustainability, stability, efficiency of capital deployment. There's a lot of different studies, and some of them are looking at things like happiness index. So are the workers in a democratically controlled firm happier than the workers not? Some of them are looking at just raw numbers in terms of like, if you take two businesses operating in the same industry, and the best studies in my opinion are like, so there was a lot of really good work done in the 80s and 90s looking at the plywood co-ops specifically here in Washington state, because you had firms in the same market, in the same industry of identical scale, and the technical production process was the same. Right? Like making plywood was a solved question. The plants were identical. So the only difference was the ownership and management scheme in these organizations. So and there's times like that where you can make really clear apples to apples comparisons. And then you look at like how much capital was reinvested in the business and the community, how much capital was extracted from the business, what were the workers paid, what were employment rates. Some people make the argument, for example, that the average wages are higher in capitalist firms than in worker-owned firms. and that's somewhat paradoxical. If you control for executive salaries, it's actually not true, but nobody does that for some reason. But what you do see is significantly more employment stability. And then there's one of the coolest studies that came out just in the last year or two is looking at the effects of things like employment stability, just the like psychological impact of feeling like you have control over what you're doing and how you're doing it in your day-to-day life. But they were really pointing specifically to the ameliorated stress from the more stable employment. They're arguing there's actually significant public health benefits compared to especially like neoliberalized firms where you've got really contingent labor force. So I can share a lot of, and then there was also a lot of research done right after 2008, right? So how do capitalist firms compare to cooperative firms in response to a financial crisis? And the answer in general was much better. So like significantly higher rates of employment maintained. They lost less money. They got back to the baseline of their operations much quicker, significantly higher rates of survivability through crisis. So it's kind of like name a measure of success other than executive pay and capital accumulation for shareholders, and then apply normal industrial relations or business, economic analysis to get those findings.
Awesome. Fred, thank you so much for not only providing us an incredible introduction / deep dive to the extent that you can in an hour to the co-op model and the principles, but also staying on for an extra 30 minutes and answering all of our questions. I want us just to all snaps, thank you, claps, so good. We really appreciate it. And we look forward whenever it is. Oh yes, you seem to have one more thing to say. Go ahead.
Yeah. Something I forgot to say, right, is that I used to, so before I got my degree and then interned at NWCDC, I spent like 16 years dropping out of colleges, trying to get a degree, and then working like in kitchens, or I was a mechanic for a while, which is all just to say, if you're interested in cooperative development, you should contact me or the center or come by the center. We're always looking for interns, and I think like 70% of the people that work here were volunteers or interns at some point before they got hired. So it's not the easiest thing to get into. And so we're kind of lucky to have the center this close. So please do reach out if this is something you're interested in exploring more, that's all.
Thank you so much.
Is your email like posted somewhere?
Yeah, so I put it in the chat, but I'll also send it in an email, and I'll send it to you, Kathleen, so you can give it to your students as well. All right. Thanks, Fred.